Finally, we are at Unit 4. We are in Period 3, 1754 to 1800. Make sure you're writing that down. And this is all about British rule and the seeds of discontent that will eventually lead to the Revolutionary War. So let's get started. So, of course, the first seeds of discontent is going to become that theory of mercantilism. And don't forget, mercantilism is the idea that the mother country is the most important thing, and the colonies are supposed to be making money for that mother country. So, the mother country is looking for exports over imports to make tons of money. So, mercantilism needed some rules, and those rules would become known as the Navigation Acts. Now, up until these, all the imports were tax free in the colonies, so the colonies kind of were benefiting. And then mother country said, oh, wait a minute, I can make more money if I enact these certain rules. And so from the 1650s through the 1660s, these colonies are going to feel the growing pains as mommy country England decides to actually try and enforce these navigation acts. So you can see in front of you that the colonies could only sell raw goods. They were not allowed to actually make anything. Say, for instance, out of the trees that were being logged in the New England colonies, they couldn't make anything out of it. They could only chop down the trees and then send the trees to England to be turned into something. So that's going to hurt their profits, of course. The colonies again could only sell through English ports. So they were trying to get rid of other countries being able to make money. And at the time, colonies in America were trading with the Dutch and the French. But now, according to Mommy England, those colonies can only sell through English ports. So that way it was heavily monitored, and no other countries were going to make any money off of the American colonies. And the American colonies would not be making money themselves either. And the third one, the colonies could only sell to England. That's a really big deal because any profits that the colonies were making is suddenly going to be cut off. So, you guys know human nature. Are the American colonies going to say, okay, mommy country, yes, we'll do this? Of course they're not. So they're going to end up having to be punished eventually from mommy England. They're bad little children and they must be punished. Punishment came in the form of a guy by the name of Sir Edmund Andros. He was made the governor of all of the New England colonies and most of the middle colonies. Their names were removed except for Pennsylvania. That's a whole different story we're not going to get into. But all of a sudden, they were known as this one large entity, the middle and the New England colonies, and they were called the Dominion of New England by Sir Edmund Andros and James II, the King of England. So all of a sudden, they have to have all these rules, and you're trying to make these places that don't have a lot of things in common suddenly be sort of the same place because of these rules that are going to be enacted through Sir Edmund Andros. And you need to start this with the understanding that Sir Edmund Andros absolutely hated Puritans. So the New England colonies are going to definitely be treated badly because of this guy. So if you can, we're going to look at some of the things that Sir Edmund Andros tried to enact in the colonies in order to have tighter control for King James. So remember, Andros is actually over here in person, and he's trying to enact the laws that James II has told him to. But that doesn't mean Andros is a good guy because he's not necessarily. So he actually used English soldiers to enforce the Navigation Acts. And whether you liked it or not, these English soldiers were allowed to live in your homes as a colonist, and you could not say no to it. You had to feed them, you had to house them, maybe even clothe them. And they were basically telling you who you could and could not trade with, and costing the colonies money. So that you're not only costing the individuals money because of them having to put you up and be your benefactor, you're also as a whole costing these colonies in New England and in the middle colonies money because they're changing who and when and where they can trade with. They also decided to take away English land titles and deeds, and to say that none of the land here in America belonged to individuals or even to towns, that it all belonged to the Dominion of New England and therefore actually belonged to James II. So no individuals. And this is Andros. He declared only marriages performed in the Anglican Church to be legal. So basically, he's telling these Puritans that they were living in sin, that none of them were legally married. And you don't tell that to a Puritan and call them sinners. You just don't do that. So he basically alienated every Puritan there was with that one act, and there's more acts to come. He forced the Puritans to take turns on Sundays with Anglicans. So Puritans who want to go to church every single Sunday, now they can't. They have to go every other Sunday, and when they weren't there, the Anglicans were there. So that is another thing. You guys know how religious the Puritans were and how dedicated. So this is just another reason to hate the mother country, and there's no sense behind it. There's no sense behind it other than that Edmund Andros hated the Puritans. He outlawed any types of gatherings whatsoever. And of course, that's going to include town meetings because these people are going to want to, they have been making their own rules and they would make them at the town meetings. And so he's outlawed that. He removed Puritan teachers so that they could be replaced with Anglican teachers. So religion through the schools is going to completely change. Where they were so connected before, religion and government, now that's going to be completely removed. And if you're teaching any kind of religion, in school, it's going to be the Anglican religion. So the Puritan children have lost part of their education, their Puritan education. Of course, this isn't going to end very well. James II is going to be overthrown by Parliament and replaced with the Glorious Revolution. Hopefully, you remember this from last year. But the Glorious Revolution removed him in a peaceful way. Nobody was killed, and his daughter and her husband, William and Mary, were asked to take his place. So his rule is going to end, and but the problem is Edmund Andros is still over here. So they put Andros in jail. And of course, they reclaimed all the rules that they had done before he showed up and did away with all the changes that he made. But they kept him in jail and they weren't really sure what to do with the guy. So Andros actually convinced a couple of guards to help him escape, but he was recaptured. So for a while, it looked like we might actually kill Sir Edmund Andros here in the colonies. Cotton Mather, remember him, the guy who stirred up everything in Salem? He was in on it too. He wanted Andros killed. He was writing articles about the guy, against the guy, and encouraging the colonists just to do away with him. James II is gone. Nobody's going to miss him. But Andros is eventually allowed to go back to New England, and he kind of just blends in with the population. He's not into politics or anything after that, so he kind of goes away. So with the new leadership in England, suddenly the colonies here in America are sort of on their own. So they are under salutary neglect again, from 1714 to 1760. So things are going to happen here in America where the colonies are going to want mother country to get involved and she's not going to. So when we need help over here, she's ignoring us. But on the flip side of that coin, she's ignoring us and letting us do things that we want to too. So there's good and bad, and that's really what this whole unit is about. It's the good and bad, looking at it from both sides, and what it is that finally leads us to the point where we say here in America, we do not need England anymore. She has not come to our rescue when we needed her to, and when she does pay attention to us, it's always something bad. So that's what this whole thing is about. But know that after Edmund Andros and James II are no longer in control, that's when salutary neglect really comes into play. And again, it's 1714 to 1760. The first real event that we need to talk about that eventually will lead us to revolution is the French and Indian War. It starts in 1756, and this is a map that you can that allows you to see exactly where it took place, some of the victories and some of the losses. But notice that it is involving the Middle and the New England colonies. Very little of the South is actually involved in it. It's important that you understand that it was not just British people over here. It wasn't just the British and the Indians being upset with one another. You had four major countries over here, and they're at each other's boundary lines by 1750 and starting to get on each other's nerves. So you've got the British, the French, the Spanish, and the Russians who will come in later, but you've got four major powers here that are at each other's back doors. So keep that in mind as we talk about the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War is also known as the Seven Years' War, so recognize it either way. The official years are 1756 to 1763, and it is known as the First Real World War. Now, the major players are France and Britain. So, why is it called the French and Indian War? Well, because it was the French that the Indians decided to help the most in this war. Remember, the French are better loved here in the New World than the British, and so they are forced in many cases to take sides. And the majority of the Indians who do get involved in this war side with France. So it becomes known as the French and Indian War. It is not the French and the Indians fighting one another, but the French and Indians fighting the British. Now, there are some Indians who are willing to fight with the British. Mostly that was the Iroquois. There were some Cherokee, but remember that it is the Iroquois that were the ones most willing to fight on the sides of the British. The whole thing is all about land, who owns what, and it's going to start in the Ohio River Valley. Both France and the British have forts that they have built there, and basically they both are under the opinion that if they just burn down a fort belonging to the other country and rebuild one of their own on top of it, that suddenly the piece of land under and around that fort belongs to their nation. So for a long time, it was just a series of burning and rebuilding forts and saying, this is my land, no, it's mine, no, it's mine, back and forth. And the Indians are all caught up in it. So let's find out what actually started this. There has to be something that ignites this fire. And believe it or not, it's going to start with our beloved first president, George Washington, when he was still a very young man. So I've tried to get through this slide like 5 times now, and somebody keeps calling me. So if I talk really, really fast through this one, that's why I got to get through it. All right, so let's talk about how George was the guy who actually started the French and Indian War, also known as the Seven-Year War. So at 1754, it's 2 years before the war actually starts. George is 22 years old, and he is sent to build a fort. You know, they love to build forts. And he's also sent to seek negotiations with the French. Now, the French have already built a pretty significant fort at a really important place. I'm going to show you a video in a minute that will explain that better, and you'll need to take notes as you watch the video. But keep in mind that there are a lot of French in the Ohio River Valley where George has been sent to build his own little fort and to negotiate with any French that show up, or that he comes along, crosses along his path. So now George is selected at 22 years old because he knows the Ohio River Valley well. He was a surveyor there for the government for a few years. So more than anybody, George knows this area. So it's not weird that at 22 years old he's sent to do something this important. So he's got about 200 guys with him, which is a pretty small group to go out and do negotiations with a power that, may or may not be wanting to start a war with you. So the government's already kind of shorthanded him here. But he goes, he's cocky, has a real attitude that he can do anything. I mean, he's 22, and he's taller than anybody else. And he was supposedly a decent looking guy, and people looked up to him. And he really thought that he was super dude. So he's sent out. He's woken up in the middle of the night by this Indian that was kind of helping him along his way. You might hear him as the Half King, but his real name was Tanagreeson. So either one, the Half King or Tanagreeson, same guy. He's one of the leaders of a local Indian tribe there to help George. And he comes to George's tent one night in the middle of the night and says, there are some French in the area. We should go meet with them. So Tanagreeson supposedly kind of presented it like this French troop seemed like they were there for trouble. I don't know how he would have known that, but he made George think that this group was here to stir something up. And so George takes just a handful of his men, not all 200, just a handful, to go check out this little French troop. And Tanner Greason, of course, is going to go with him. So when they finally find the French troop, George doesn't attempt to negotiate with these men or even speak to them. He just orders his men to open fire. And so this becomes known as the first shots of the 7 Years' War. Now it's 2 years too early, but these shots that were fired by George and his men are the reason that we end up in a war with the French. And so they are the first shots 2 years too early. It only takes about 15 minutes, and the French completely give up. The leader of this little French group was a guy by the name of Jumonville. Now, Jumonville supposedly was not killed in the initial firing. He was still alive when George and Tanner Greason and the rest of the men walked in to kind of look around, see what was going on, take the survivors as prisoners, and they supposedly found Jumonville still alive. Now, I'm saying supposedly because there's more than one version of this story, but we're going to go with what the most people said that were first-hand witnesses. So, according to most witnesses, Jumonville was still alive, and George goes up to him and starts to ask him, like, "Why are you here? What were you doing?" And Jumonville reaches in his pocket and pulls out this paperwork from the French government. And lo and behold, Jumonville was there for the exact same reason that George was there. Only Jumonville was there for the French. He was there to build a fort. He was there to seek negotiations with the British, being George. He was not there to do anything evil. Tanner Greason had just kind of gotten George and his men fired up for no reason whatsoever. So when George hears that Jumonville was not there to do them any harm, he was only there to talk to the British. George knows he's in trouble. So what does he do? So supposedly George is standing there weighing his options. What do I do with this guy? No matter what I do, it's going to be bad. And Tanner Greason supposedly takes it upon himself to handle the situation. He steps forward. He kills Jumonville by slicing him in the head with a hatchet. And supposedly that wasn't enough. He actually reached inside Jumonville's head and pulled out his brains and cleaned his hands in Jumonville's brains. Tanner Greason wanted to make sure he was dead, I guess. So now they're really in trouble. George has not been able to hold his men together, so that looks really bad to the British. He's killed a negotiator. That's going to look really bad to the British and the French. He knows he's in trouble. So he goes back to his camp and he tells his men, we need to build a fort. We've got to have a place to hunker down. The French are going to come after us. He also sent out a runner to go get reinforcements from the British. So he builds this fort. It gets the name Fort Necessity because it's built, it's a necessity to build it to protect themselves. It's built in 5 days. And in those 5 days, George is hoping that he's going to get reinforcements. He never does. The French come in, and it happens to be Jumonville's brother, who is the head of the French troop that comes in and takes down Fort Necessity and takes George and his men in as prisoners. And he has a confession signed by George. But the problem is that the confession is all in French. George has no idea what it says. But in order to save his life and the life of his men, he feels that he has to sign the confession, and he does. And so that signed confession is considered to be the reason that the war will start 2 years later. That's the reason that the French use. And basically it said that George Washington, with the blessing of the British, went in and wiped out this troop. And both sides made things up. Both of them did. The odd thing about this event is that we really get our first look at George as a soldier. George wrote a letter to his brother about what happened, and of course he didn't do the details about Tanner Greason, cleaning his hands and Jumonville's brains, but he does talk about the battlefield and what it was like as he's running across the battlefield in that 15-minute skirmish. And he calls the bullets flying past him a charming ordeal, that he was charmed by it. So right off the bat, we know that George really liked being engaged in battle and loved the adrenaline of it. He was an adrenaline junkie, and we will get more proof of that as the French and Indian War progresses and we see more and more of George in it. But George is a true warrior, and he has no problem going against the French again. Here is a picture of Fort Necessity, and you see, of course, it's been torn down and they rebuilt according to the plans. But you can see that it was not a great fortification. Again, it was only built in 5 days. I'm sure it wasn't even this good. Because where would they get the boards and stuff to make it look this good? By the time that the French got there, most of the British had George's men now had removed themselves from the inside of the fence. It was too crowded in there. They had 200 men. So most of them were just laying on their bellies in that little ditch that you see behind Fort Necessity, and they were easily taken over. I mean, this was kind of a joke. There was nothing to it, but it's still there. If you want to go and look at it today, they've rebuilt it according to the plans that George had laid out. So it's a neat place to visit. And once you're there, it's really easy for you to see why they were taken so quickly, even though George, was this big bad warrior. So now the year is 1755. George is still in the Ohio River Valley. And now a new order has been given by the British government to actually go in and capture Fort Duquesne. That's that fort that I mentioned that was at a very significant place at the fork of three rivers. The French had built this massive fort there, and the British wanted that area because it was at a place where three rivers came together, very fertile soil. So, of course, the British want it. So now George is 23 years old, and a new commander is sent in to take down Fort Duquesne, and his name was Edward Braddock. George thought that Edward Braddock was the best military guy ever. He just really worshiped the man. Edward Braddock really in reality was not the smartest guy to take on Fort Duquesne. He did some things that definitely led to disaster. He took a 1400 or sorry he took over 2000 men on this long hike where he had to clear the brush away. There was a time period where he only made it 20 miles in a week, because there were so many men and he insisted on taking so much equipment with him. It was just this terribly, terribly visible group of people making their way through the forest to go take down Fort Duquesne. It's not like they were sneaking in. So at one point, he does decide to leave part of the group behind, and instead of taking all of them, he ends up taking about 1,400. So it's a little bit of a smaller group, but it's still massive. The French know that they're coming, and when they are, in the close proximity to Fort Duquesne, the French come up with a plan between them and some Canadians that are willing to fight with them and some Indian tribes. And the French, some of them actually dress like Indians, and they go into the forest and they start enacting guerrilla warfare to take down the British. And the British are still using this square attack where they're all clumped together in this giant square, and they're very, very visible. And so at first, because there's so many of them, it looks like the British might actually be successful. But once the Indians and the Canadians and some of the French that were dressing like Indians got around the British and surrounded them and started performing guerrilla warfare, these British had no chance whatsoever. So they end up losing 900 of the 1,400 men. Braddock is shot. He lives for about 5 days, but by the time that he's shot, they're starting to retreat. George is in charge, while Edward Braddock is slowly dying. And Edward Braddock finally does die. George digs his grave along the road that his men had actually built on the way in, and then he had all the wagons roll over top of the grave so that nobody would know where this man was buried and try to dig him up and disgrace his grave. So George makes it back with the men that are left, and now he's an even bigger hero. So the war still has not started officially. It's only 1755, but this is the second skirmish that involves George, and a lot of death on both sides. So he's definitely a part of this war. And now, with this many Indians being involved, the Indians are definitely a part of this war and on the French side. So it's going to become again known as the French and Indian War, because it's a French and Indian on one side and the British on the other, with very few Indians willing to take the British side other than the Iroquois. So again, French and Indian versus British for the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War. Now, in between the events at Fort Necessity and the events at Fort Duquesne, there are a group of people that decide that they don't like the way that the British are treating the colonists, and they don't think that they're really going to help them get through this battle with the French or with the Indians. And so they decide to take steps to become a united front, not only against the French, but against the British, and to become their own entity as the colonies in America. And this group became known as the Albany Congress. They were called together in 1754. It was not a unanimous representation, but 7 of the 13 colonies did send people. So we have Ben Franklin leading it, 23 delegates from the 7 different colonies, and 150 Iroquois. And they create what's known as the Albany Plan for Union. And basically, again, it is to be a united front against the British, to get the British out so that they can fight this war against the French and the Indians in the way that the colonists see fit. They don't like the way that the British are doing things, and they want their own say in how to get these people out of the Ohio River Valley. So Ben Franklin actually comes up with this idea of join or die. Now, again, only 7 of the 13 colonies sends anybody, so it does fail. But it is the first, and this is why it's significant, the Albany Congress, it's the first planned attempt to disassociate themselves from the British. The colonies want to disassociate themselves from the British. The problem is that some of the colonies are afraid of a centralized government here in America. They're afraid that they're going to lose their own individual power. And so that's why you only have 7 of the 13 that do come. And again, the Albany Congress and the Albany Plan for Union it is a failure, but it is that first attempt. That's why it's so important. And later, of course, when the Revolutionary War is in full swing, they will bring back that old join or die adage, and it becomes the call to revolution. So Ben Franklin created it. It will disappear for a little while, but it's going to come back again when we fight that Revolutionary War. So it's still really significant. I wish that we had time to talk about more of the events that took place during the French and Indian War. But again, know that it started with George. It's going to escalate when they try to take over Fort Duquesne. War is actually declared in 1756, and by 1763, it's over. So the treaty that is going to end it is going to be known as the Treaty of Paris. Make sure you know that. The French will lose their claims in North America, but we allow them to keep Louisiana. And if you should know, even now, there's a very strong French influence in Louisiana, and that's why. So again, the French will lose claims in North America, and the Spanish will lose Florida in exchange for Cuba. So make sure you know those things. French and Indian War results. French lose claims in North America, and the Spanish lose Florida but get Cuba. So these things are going to change hands again later. You got to know them. So look at your boundaries before the war, look at your boundaries after the war, and who had what. Well, the French and Indian War had lasting effects that no one could have foreseen, especially the British Crown. The colonists really felt that they had won this war on their own, because the British involvement often led to these fiascos. They just weren't willing to listen to the fact that war was different here in the colonies. And so when the British end up winning, or the colonists end up winning, the colonists kind of feel like they did it themselves, not the British. And so it leads to this new confidence among the colonists. And it also leads to colonial unity, a unity they have not felt since the Great Awakening. They also witnessed the British incompetence as far as being unwilling to get rid of that really silly idea of the square formation, where basically your men are out in the open and they're sitting targets. They thought it was not gentlemanly to use guerrilla warfare, and so we saw a lot of men die because of that. That would have been bad enough. But here you are at the end of a war, and suddenly the British government decides to put a stricter regulation on the North American colonies. They need money. So after all of this, they fought to keep what they have, the colonists have, and all of a sudden, England is going to come back after all these years and say, "Hey, you need to start following the rules, and the rules are that you need to make money for the crown." And so the crown has had soldiers over here for quite a while now. They have spent a lot of money, and they need to make that money back. So the war ends salutary neglect, and there is going to be a question about that on the test. What ends salutary neglect? You need to say the French and Indian War, and it's because England needs money. So they're going to have this huge change in the way that things are done. And one of the big things is, of course, we're going to go back to that mommy has to make money, and it doesn't really matter if that hurts the colonies. And so after all these years of salutary neglect, you have a stricter enforcement of those silly navigation acts where the colonies have to do all kinds of crazy things, and they will lose money and mommy will make money. So this is considered the beginning of the end of British control in America. So a huge result of the French and Indian War is that step towards independence, or a desire at least to want to be independent from the Crown of England. We have to remember that it's not just the colonists who are going to face all these changes. It's not just the French who have to face changes because they were kicked out. We've got to remember that there are all these native tribes that were still there in the Ohio River Valley, and they have been protected by the French for a really long time. So what's going to happen to them when the French are booted out? Some of them are not going to wait to find out what's going to happen to them. And one great example is a Indian leader by the name of Pontiac. And Pontiac is going to take his future into his own hands, and he's going to start a rebellion. Now he's an Ottawa chief, and there are French trappers still in the area, and they're friends. And so Pontiac convinces them to help these French trappers to help go after the British and attack forts all over the valley, hoping to scare them out. And his hit and run attacks ends up killing 2,000 British. So the colonists have to get together and figure out exactly how do you get rid of such a force, especially when they did have French trappers that were helping them too. Like, it was really hard to see who the enemy and who the friend of the British was in the Ohio River Valley. So they decided to do something really drastic. And the British, for the first time, purposely decided to give diseases to the Indians. So the British arranged for blankets to be sent to Pontiac's people, and they did it under the guise of saying, we want this to be a gift for peace. So please accept this gift of blankets. The winter's coming. We know your people need them. And so his group, the Ottawa, accepted them, but they had actually been blankets that have been used on people who were infected with smallpox. And we all know how susceptible Indians were to that disease. And so they use them, and of course it kills them off, stops the rebellion. Pontiac is actually killed by an Indian from another tribe. I think that they were afraid of going through the same fate as Pontiac's people if he was not stopped. And so an Indian from another tribe actually killed him, and that stops Pontiac's rebellion. But this is just one instance of what happened to the Indians that were left behind, that were willing to help the French in hopes that their own future would be a good future. And of course, it was not, because of the retaliation of the British that were left in the Ohio Valley. And this is just a map to kind of give you an idea of exactly where Pontiac's rebellion took place. It was not a small rebellion. You can see that it took place in many different areas. And so he really truly was a force to be reckoned with. And the British people felt that they had to do something drastic to get rid of him. And again, it will be that horrible decision to give his tribe smallpox on purpose. So we see a snowball effect starting to happen. The French being removed from the Ohio River Valley led to Pontiac's Rebellion. And now Pontiac's Rebellion is going to lead to an event that was caused by a pretty nasty group of British called the Paxton Boys. And this was a direct response to Pontiac's uprising. They become a vigilante group in Paxitani Church, Pennsylvania, and they decide they're going to get rid of all the Indians in the Ohio River Valley. And you need to know that they were mostly Scots Irish frontiersmen, which means that their ancestors probably came here as indentured servants, right? There's 500 of them. So this is not a tiny, tiny group. Well, the Paxtons go to this local tribe, this Susquehannock tribe, and they trapped 6 Indians in a cabin and burned the cabin to the ground. So there were another 14 Susquehannock who were witness to this, and they ran to the local British town and said, "Please help us. This is what's happening. These Paxton boys are attacking us." And so they are taken into protective custody by the British law. Now they're taken into protective custody, and these Paxton boys broke in and killed them all. So the boys heard from somebody that a larger group of these Susquehannock people had made a run to Philadelphia looking for help, and so the Paxton boys follow them. They want the whole tribe gone. And so they end up in Philadelphia, and who do they meet on the outskirts of the city of Philadelphia but Ben Franklin? And Ben Franklin settles them down, and he does have a local militia with him, and he kind of makes a deal with these guys. You won't be punished if you stop what you're doing, but we know who you are. We do plan on punishing you if you keep doing this. You really need to turn around and you need to go home. And so he makes this deal for peace with the Paxton boys. You know, you won't be punished for the murders that have already taken place if you just go away. And so the Paxton boys do. But here's the problem: it didn't happen overnight. It took several days of negotiation between Ben and his militia group and these Paxton boys. And in the meantime, these Native Americans had come into Philadelphia, and they had been sequestered for safety. They had been sequestered in this small space, and lo and behold, they got smallpox, and they all died anyway. So this is this huge, huge snowball effect. Well, of course, word of all of this is going to finally make its way back to England, that you have, Pontiac's Rebellion and the Paxton boys showing up and doing bad things. And so for the first time, Britain is asked by the colonists, "Please come help us. You have to protect us because we don't think that you're going to. The Paxton boys would never have happened if we felt like you were going to protect us. The Paxton boys is a direct result of you not helping us enough." And so, of course, this is one of the first events that shows how little faith the colonies had in the British to protect them. And this is just going to get worse. This is just a stop in that snowball effect. The snowball is going to get worse and worse. So before the Paxton boys, after the Paxton boys, colonists are asking for help from the British Crown, and help is not coming. And the snowball is going to get bigger with the proclamation of 1763. And this was a new law created by the British government that told the colonists that they were no longer allowed to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. They said that they did not have the money or the men to protect them if they moved beyond that point, that the current colonies was as much as they could protect, and so they actually made it illegal. Well, these people came to this new world to get land, and now you're telling them that they can't have it. So the British realize that they're going to have to eventually allow these people to go west of the Appalachian Mountains. But here's a great question on the screen: if Britain's ever going to revoke this proclamation, what do they need? And of course, the answer is going to be money. And are they going to get the money from the people living in England? Of course not. They're going to get the money from the people living in the colonies. It's a colonial problem. And so now the snowball is about to be ginormous. Now, that snowball is going to get really big when it came to how to raise money for the British Crown. And of course, that's always going to take the shape in the form of taxes. So, of course, the Crown was already taxing the colonies, and that tax was called a molasses Act. So it was a 6% tax. And with the Sugar Act in 1764, that Molasses Act was done away with. The 6% was done away with. And now instead of paying 6% on sugar and sugar products, you only paid a 3% tax. Now we're going to add a couple more things to it. So it's not just sugar products, it's wine, coffee, textiles, and indigo. But again, it went from a 6% to a 3% tax. Well, why would the colonists be mad about this? Okay, now here's going to get a little confusing, so make sure you listen. At 6%, the crown was making okay money, so they weren't really paying attention to people smuggling these goods in and not paying the tax. Remember that salutary neglect and all that was taking place too. So at 6%, a lot of people just ignored it. And a lot of smugglers were making a whole lot of money. And one of those big guys, big name guys, was John Hancock. He was making a lot of money. If the crown is charging 6% and a smuggler can charge a whole lot less than that, well, the smugglers are going to make a whole lot of money. But here's the problem. When they lowered it to 3%, it was actually cheaper to buy it from the British Crown and pay that tax than it was to go through a smuggler. And if the smuggler lowered their prices anymore, they wouldn't be making any money anyway. So it made the smugglers unhappy. And the smugglers were many of the guys that we consider to be our founding fathers. These are the rich guys. So these are the men that start speaking out against the Sugar Act because they can't smuggle anymore. Isn't that nice to know that our country is founded on criminals like that? But that's the truth of it. And so John Hancock and many other men came up with this idea that you see the quote in front of you: a British subject shall not be bound to taxes but what he has consented to through his representative. So they're trying to argue the point that the colonies had no representatives in British Parliament and there shall be no taxation without what? You guessed it, representation. No taxation without representation. Now, they had been being taxed without representation before, but now all of a sudden you're really hurting the wallets of those rich guys like John Hancock, Samuel Adams. I could name a whole bunch of them. And suddenly it's a problem to be taxed without representation. And it was all because the smugglers were not making money anymore. Now, I don't want you to think that it was just smugglers that got upset, because it wasn't. There were other rules that were enacted as well, and one of them was the Quartering Act in 1765. So we've got to have more people from the British Crown, more British military over here to protect people from things like Pontiac type of rebellions, the Paxton Boys. So the Crown is trying to bring more people over here, but they don't have the money to pay people to put them up, and they don't have anywhere to put them other than people's houses. And so they created a law called the Quartering Act in 1765 that any military could come into your home and ask to be quartered there, and you were not allowed to say no. So you had to use your money as a colonist to feed and house and serve these guys. And sometimes these guys were kind of nasty. They felt like they were over here serving the British Crown, and they were kind of well, they were better than the colonists over here, and so they treated the colonists as their servants. And so they kind of took over their households and made pigs of themselves and asked for more than their fair share, took their way with their women often, and was just doing really bad things. And the crown was not doing anything to discipline these men because they needed them here. So it's kind of a rock and a hard place. They got to have the guys here. The only place to put them is in people's houses, and people didn't want them because the men were acting badly. So again, here comes the snowball, bigger and bigger and bigger. Taxes didn't stop either. The British Crown created another version of tax called the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act was a tax on paper goods. So it affected all of the colonists. Again, the British Crown is doing this to raise revenue to pay the soldiers in America. But the Stamp Act, putting a tax on all paper goods, think of all the things that you use that's paper. So any kind of a license that you got that you had to have paper for, you had to pay a tax on. Just regular old paper to write letters. Remember, they don't have internet. You wrote a lot of letters back then. You had to pay a tax on it. You had to pay tax on playing cards, which everyone played cards back then. That was the biggest form of entertainment. And you had to pay a tax on each individual playing card, and there's 52 of them. So it did affect everybody. So the colonists got together and they created something called the Stamp Act Congress. And this was to fight against the Stamp Act. So they got delegates from 9 colonies. Remember, when they tried to do the Albany Congress, they only got 7. Now they got 9. And they petitioned to repeal this Stamp Act, and they wrote something called the Declaration of Rights and Grievances of the Colonist. And this is the first time they put in paper that idea of no taxation without representation, and they sent it to the king. And of course, the king was very, very upset about it. But the colonists were adamant, and they created a group called the Sons of Liberty. And the Sons of Liberty were a group of men in the beginning that basically traveled from town to town and looked for tax collectors. They burned some tax collector dolls in effigy. They weren't real people, but they made them look like real people and put, tax collector across their chest and burned them in effigy. Other tax collectors, real people, were actually captured and tarred and feathered and threatened with hanging. And so the tax collectors decided that they would not collect taxes anymore. So this group, the Stamp Act Congress, found a way to not pay that Stamp Act because the tax collectors were scared to death to try and collect it. So the British Crown in 1766 is going to come up with the Declaratory Act. And it did repeal the Stamp Act. It reduced that molasses tax, not the sugar tax, but the molasses tax to 1%. So they're thinking that they're doing a good thing. But again, they're not. The smugglers are going to get mad over this one. But the thing that got the most angry about is at the bottom of the Declaratory Act, the British Crown decided that they would write a statement which reaffirmed that Britain had the power to make laws to bind the colonies, whether the colonies liked it or not. And so basically this was a statement by the king to say, ha ha ha, we can do whatever we want to, you did not win this time. And all it really did was upset the colonists. Did the colonists win? Yes, they did. The Stamp Act got repealed. But the crown is still saying, we still have our thumb on you, and we will forever and forever. So it really was a jerky move to add that to the Declaratory Act. But again, this is the mommy country trying to bring her baby country, who is now misbehaving, back under parental control. So everybody's a little bit out of control at this point. So a year later, the Crown comes up with a new tax called the Townshend Acts. And again, it's only a year later, 1767, and it was on many things: paper, paint, glass. Big one was tea. And the point of this one was for the Crown to raise money to pay these imperial officials so that they did not have to be dependent on the colonies to pay their paycheck. And that way, hopefully, these imperial officials would be honest, because the crown is paying them and not the colonies, so they wouldn't allow like smuggling to take place and things like that. Well, people got really upset. I mean, this is a tax on things that people use all the time, especially the tea. People use it all the time. And so the colonists got together and they signed what was called a non-importation agreement, where they boycotted British goods. And one of the biggest ones that they boycotted was going to be textiles. So a group of women got together and created an actual kind of club all throughout the colonies, and they named themselves the Daughters of Liberty. And these Daughters of Liberty held spinning bees. And so they wove the cloth for the colonies to buy so that they didn't have to buy from the British anymore. And they actually really did put a huge dent in the amount of goods, textile goods, that the colonies were buying from the British, so much so that the British were worried that they were losing so much money. Now, these Daughters of Liberty also used the spinning bees to keep gossip alive about who was buying goods from the British still. And of course, the Sons of Liberty were around still, and they also would spread the word of who was still buying British goods. Sometimes they learned from the Daughters of Liberty who it was, and then the Sons of Liberty would go basically harass these people so that they would not buy goods from the British. And they kept watch on the ports. They published the names of people who were actually using British goods. It was basically you were outed and treated as a person that had committed treason almost if you bought British goods. And again, it was to the point where the British income was highly affected. And of course, you still have prominent figures like Ben Franklin up in Boston, Massachusetts, who is very against the government of England having any say in what's happening in the New World. And this is a great quote from him. Let us return to the pre-1763 mercantilist system, repeal the British laws, renounce British right, recall the troops, refund the money, and he goes on and on and on, so much so that he and men like him encouraged 2,000 British troops to head to Boston to confront Ben Franklin and men like him to stop the madness. And so Ben is in this, to his chin from the very, very beginning and loving it. Ben loved to cause problems. So because of him, you've got this giant group of British troops coming to Boston to keep him from running his mouth and to make sure that the Townshend Acts are obeyed and paid, and that these groups, these Daughters of Liberty and these Sons of Liberty, are broken up. So they have a big job ahead of them. These 2,000 group of men heading to Boston to take down Ben Franklin. So these guys heading to Boston is going to end up as what we now know as the Boston Massacre. So how did that happen? Well, there was tense relations, of course, but the British didn't show up there and start, firing on people. That's not what happened at all. And was it a massacre? No, only 5 people were killed, but we'll get to that. What happened was there was a group of colonists that had gone to a local bar and had a couple drinks too many. And when they came out of the bar, there were British officers in the street. They were patrolling, and that was their job. And the colonists started saying nasty things to the British officers, and the British officers said nasty things back. And before you know it, it was winter, and so the colonists started picking snow up off the ground and turning it into snowballs and throwing it at the soldiers. And so the soldiers started throwing them back. And then the colonists started putting rocks in the snowballs, and so did the soldiers. And we don't know who did it. But eventually in this scuffle, this snowball fight, and the Boston Massacre did start as a snowball fight. In the snowball fight, somebody dropped their gun and the gun went off. And when it went off, the British guys thought, oh my gosh, here, we're in it. Everybody start firing. And they did. And so we end up with 5 colonists that were killed. Now, one of the colonists that was killed was actually a black man. His name was Crispus Attucks. And so they wanted to make such a big deal of this colonist event as like a murderous event that even though Crispus Attucks was a black man and you already had racism in the colonies, even in Boston, yes, in Boston, they buried Crispus Attucks in a white cemetery and to show that he was like a hero. So that got people all riled up. Paul Revere, you guys know Paul Revere, the British is coming. He didn't really do what they say he did. We'll get to that later. But Paul Revere did paint this painting. And it looks like the revolutionary guy or the British guys are lined up using the colonists as target practice. And that is not what happened. It became this giant propaganda campaign. The captain of the British, Captain Thomas Preston, was arrested for manslaughter along with 8 of his other men. Now, they're all going to be acquitted, but the whole thing was about this propaganda to convince other colonists that this was a manslaughter massacre and that the British had come to do this evil deed. And that is not what happened at all. They came to calm things down because of Ben Franklin and other men like him who were kind of mouthing off in Boston. And because the relations were so tense, of course something was going to happen. But remember, it started as a snowball fight. And can you really call 5 people dying, as horrible as it is to lose 5 lives, is it a massacre? And look at the picture by Paul Revere, completely inaccurate. But because the propaganda, called it a massacre, and you have this picture of evil, basically, evil people killing innocent people, this Boston Massacre is remembered as the key event that really galvanized the colonial public to the patriot cause. We need to end the evils of British rule. So if you got to pinpoint this one moment where the colonists really came together, it would be the Boston Massacre, and because of the propaganda that came out of it. And don't forget Paul Revere's part in it. After the Boston Massacre, the Crown was scared, for lack of a better way to say it. They were scared. So John Adams, acting as a lawyer for the Crown now, for the King, negotiated the removal of all taxes. The only one the King would not remove, and he would not budge on this, is the tax on tea. And we all know where this story is going, right? But let's take a step back first before we get into the tea issue. By 1772, the people in Boston, that's kind of the hotbed of people who are very political and want change and want Britain to do the right thing. And so they came up with the idea of a group called the Committees of Correspondence, and it was created and run by Samuel Adams. He was also a smuggler, by the way. They all were. But by 1774, the Committees of Correspondence were in 11 of the 13 colonies. So most of the members of the committee were also members of the Sons of Liberty. And they spread these messages all through the colonies. And whenever they could, they would spy on leaders from the Crown and find ways to bring them down, run them off, throw a wrench into their plans. Just basically, do things to get on their nerves and upset the king. Later, we'll use the Sons of Liberty more of a call to arms and alarm. The British is coming, that kind of thing. But in the beginning, 1772 to 74, they are really just a group to antagonize the British and to keep up with their movements. What are they doing now? And to spread the word of what they're doing now throughout the colonies. It was a pretty ingenious plan. They didn't have much way to connect with one another. You're talking a lot of miles between all 13 colonies, and they found this way to communicate with one another. So a man would leave one village, go to another one, which was his regular destination, leave the message there, and then a man would pick it up and move to the next village. So it's like a game of telephone, only this one was much more accurate than we normally think of as the game of telephone. And it kept everyone informed, and it kept everybody angry at the Crown. So now we get to the actual Boston Tea Party. So it's going to happen in 1773. The Townshend Acts are dead, but remember the King George III, I don't think I've mentioned him yet, King George III, he decides that he's not going to remove the tax on tea. One of the reasons is that the British East India Company is starting to struggle, and he needs money to invest back into that company to save them. British East India Company has been around for a really long time. You learned about them in World II. They are the ones that moved into India and basically took it away from the Indians there. So this has been around for a really long time, and he doesn't want to lose it. And the Crown has a lot of money invested in the British East India Company. And so what the King does is he keeps the tax on tea, but he decides to make the overall price of it not that much more, thinking that, well, actually it was less. And he's thinking that the colonists won't mind. So he lowers the price of tea by a lot. The shopkeepers aren't going to like it, but the colonists, the guys purchasing it, would appreciate it. So he lowers the price of tea and adds a tax. But even with the price and the tax, it's still less than it used to be. But here's the problem. King George is not in the colonies. He doesn't realize that there's already an attitude against the crown. And so here's the problem. The colonists, all they saw it was another tax. It's another tax, and we can't have taxation without representation. So even if the overall price is cheaper, you just said you're taxing us again, and we just went through this big rigmarole to get rid of taxes. So everyone is upset. And don't forget that most of our founding fathers are smugglers. So once again, just like with the Sugar Act, you've got these smugglers like John Hancock and John Adams, by the way, both Sons of Liberty members, who are going to lose money on the cheap tea because they were both smuggling it. So these guys, the Sons of Liberty, including John Hancock and John Adams, dressed up as Indians, 200 of them. They went to the 3 ships in the Boston Harbor. They were all ships belonging to the British East India Company. And before it could be unloaded to local stores, they dumped these chests of tea. There were 340 chests. 46 tons of tea were dumped into the Boston Harbor. And I've read stories about how the tea, of course, it's not going to sink. You guys have seen tea in water before. You have to like force it down. So there's these massive clumps of tea floating everywhere, 46 tons of it, all over the Boston Harbor. It was quite a mess. And the Sons of Liberty were out in little canoes beating the tea, trying to make it sink so that nobody from the British East India Company could, haul it back in and dry it out. I'm sure it was actually pretty funny at the time. But King George III was not amused. King George III is going to do a lot of things to punish the colonists for this terrible act of dumping the tea into the harbor. And so he calls them the Coercive Acts of 1774. So you should know the word coercive means like to convince people to do something, convince them of something. So he thinks these new laws or these new acts are going to convince the colonists to behave. But the colonists immediately came back with changing the name of them in the colonies from the Coercive Acts, which the king called them, to the Intolerable Acts. So if you were a colonist, you called them intolerable. Same group of rules and laws, but coercive acts to the king, intolerable acts to the colonist. And make sure you know what each one did. So the Port Bill, probably the most explosive of all of them, it closed the port of Boston, which meant that Boston was going to lose a ton of money. The Massachusetts Government Act, pretty self-explanatory. It shut down all local governments. So basically they had no say in anything. Every rule was now coming directly from the crown, being George III. They also reinstated a version of the Quartering Act, only this time the colonists weren't just housing men in their homes and doing as they were told. They actually had to take their own money and build barracks for the soldiers so that they could babysit the people of Boston and other colonies that might rebel. And then they did the Justice Act, where trials could take place outside of Boston for British officials who committed crimes during this time. So if a British official did something bad in Boston, they were not going to be tried in Boston, which means that they were going to get a trial that basically set them free. So all of this is punishments specifically set at the people of Boston, because the people of Boston are being used as an example to all the other colonists. What is going to happen to you if you don't obey? George has had it. He's ticked and he's had it, and he's ready for his children to finally pay attention to him and respect him. He was crazy anyway. We'll meet more George later, but he was not a person that you could reason with. And so he goes a little bit crazy with these intolerable acts. And you can see why the colonists were upset. So really bad things are about to happen. Now there's a lot on this slide, so make sure you're taking really good notes. But the colonial response to all these new rules that King George had come up with against Boston created the idea of a first continental congress where the colonies would send delegates and their political delegates to finally do something about the king. So this is 1774, right after those intolerable acts are issued on the people of Boston. The colonies were so upset. And again, it was not just Boston is the one being punished, but they all realized that it's coming their way too. So they all sent delegates in this time except for Georgia, and Georgia wanted to. The only reason they didn't, and make sure you write this down, is because they were fighting an Indian uprising at the time and they needed British support. They needed the military. So they pretended to be on Georgia's side to keep British military there to help fight against the Indians. But they were really on the same page as all the other colonies. So all the colonies but Georgia sent delegates in, and we're talking men like Patrick Henry, Sam Adams, John Adams, you know all of them. So together as a group, they petitioned King George to stop the intolerable acts, and they promised him that they would boycott all British goods, and they would not only stop imports of British goods, but they would also stop exports coming out of Europe, or coming out of the colonies and going into England. So England is going to lose money either way, like no imports, no exports. This is a lot of money to be lost by King George and England. Now, at the same time, a group got together in a town called Suffolk, Massachusetts. This is the same time that the First Continental Congress is meeting. And because they met in the town of Suffolk, they wrote a paper called the Suffolk Resolves. And basically, they were asking the question, should we raise a colonial militia to go against King George and against England? And they kind of laid out a plan how to do this. And it was Paul Revere who took that idea from Suffolk, Massachusetts, and the Suffolk people, and took that piece of paper called the Suffolk Resolves to the First Continental Congress and urged them to create a colonial militia. So that idea is in their head now with the First Continental Congress. So they're asking themselves, do we create a militia? They've already said to King George, we will not buy or give anything to you anymore. And before they leave, they haven't actually really set anything in motion. It's all kind of these ideas right now. But the most important thing that they did before they left is they resolved that they would come together again during a Second Continental Congress if George refuses to end the intolerable acts. So they've already set that idea in motion that this is not over. He's got till a certain time to end those intolerable acts. We will come back together, go back to that question of a colonial militia, and definitely not buy any more goods from England or give any more goods to England. Big, big steps towards revolution. We've met a lot of people who encourage the colonists towards rebellion against England. Ben Franklin, Sam Adams, John Adams, but we can't forget John Locke. John Locke is famous for writing the two treatises on government. And basically, he in that talks about all these rights that we have, these natural rights. He borrows the idea of Rousseau that we exist in a social contract, an unwritten contract between government and people. And basically, it says that if your government is good, that you should follow them and do as you're told. If your government is bad, you have the right, a natural right, to go against them, bring them down, and create a better government. And choosing between whether your government is good or not, you use reason and logic. So he goes against the government and basically tells people it's okay to say, hey, you're not good, and we're going to take you down and find somebody else to rule us. But he also went against the church. He promoted the idea of something called a tabula rasa. And basically it means that we are born as a blank slate and we learn to become the people that we become, whether it's good or bad. This goes against that idea of predestination. And remember, you're dealing with a lot of people that are Calvinist in this time period. Don't forget the Great Awakening was led by Calvinists. A lot of the people that were the original Pilgrims were Calvinist. So he's going against the church and the government, and people saw him as brave, that he was willing to make changes, and it taught them to question their own existence, whether it was political or religious, using reason and logic. And so they kind of go together. We have done a lot to change our religion, and so we're going to use that idea of change in our government, or we have made a lot of changes in our government. We're going to use that to change our religion. So he's opening the door for both. And he was very influential of his time and considered a hero by many people because he was willing to question the big entities in their lives, the church and government. So before we end this unit and get into the actual revolution, there's some terms and groups that I want to make sure that you understand. One of them, of course, being the Sons of Liberty. Make sure you understand that they were considered a secret society. They were made up of middle class and upper class men that organized protests for the very first time in the colonies to bring the colonies together to fight against what they considered to be the wrongs of the King of England, being George III. How did they do that? They got people to sign petitions. They wrote letters of grievances. So it wasn't always violent. I want to make sure that you understand that. They also used boycotts. And boycotts are non-importation agreements, which basically says we will not use the goods from England. We won't allow people to buy them. And that became very, very popular. Don't forget that women also played a very important part in leading up to the war because they helped with enforcing those boycotts. They had the sewing bees, and they helped their husbands figure out who was on whose side through gossip and things like that. So the ladies had a big say in this. And then, of course, you have those committees of correspondence at secret meetings all over the colonies, especially in the North, that would strategize. They would eventually become like shadow governments. Paul Revere was one of their major writers, and they did a lot of damage to the word of the king in the colonies by tripping people up, running people off, putting a wrench in their plans when they had come up with a way to get a certain colony to agree. So these are your sabotage people, the committees of correspondence. And again, most of them were Sons of Liberty, so those two groups go hand in hand. All right, so I think you know a lot of what you need to know to understand the revolution in the next unit. And, I know this has been super exciting. It's going to get even more exciting. I can't wait to tell you the rest of the story. So hold on. We'll tell more in the next unit.